Welcome to episode 155 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's April 4, 2009, Wolfsburg, Volkswagen Arena. And today's story is about one of the great modern Bundesliga ambushes. Because on this day in 2009, VfL Wolfsburg beat defending champions Bayern Munich 5-1, went top of the Bundesliga, and never gave the lead back. This was not supposed to happen. Not against Bayern, not in April, and not to a club like Wolfsburg. That is what makes it so good. This is a story about scale and timing, about a giant stumbling through a season it never controlled, about a challenger that had only recently stopped looking over its shoulder at the relegation zone, and about one afternoon when the title race did not merely tighten, it flipped. But how did we get here? To understand why April 4 felt so improbable, you have to start with the shape of German football at the time. Bayern München was still Bayern München. The giant, the gravitational center, the club everybody measures themselves against. They had won 3 of the previous 4 Bundesliga titles and arrived in 2008-09 as defending champions. The new coach was Jürgen Klinsmann, the World Cup winner, brought in to modernize the operation and refresh the mood after Ottmar Hitzfeld. So even before a ball was kicked, the basic expectation was familiar. Bayern first, the rest trying to interfere. Wolfsburg, by contrast, were not one of the old aristocrats. They had only been in the Bundesliga since 1997. This was still, in historical terms, a relatively new top-flight club, a club from a city more associated with Volkswagen than with football mythology. And not long before this title season, Wolfsburg had looked much more like a club trying to survive than one preparing to rule. All that changed with Felix Magath. Magath arrived in 2007, and his appointment mattered for 2 reasons. First, because he was a serious manager with real weight, and second, because he had been Bayern coach himself. So Wolfsburg were not hiring a dreamer, they were hiring a man who knew exactly what the standard looked like. His first season already changed their trajectory. Wolfsburg finished 5th in 2007-08, their best Bundesliga finish at that point. That was progress. But even then, they still ended the season 22 points behind Bayern, so the gap remained enormous. The improvement was real, but the hierarchy still looked intact. Then came 2008-09, and the league took on a strange shape. Bayern never settled into command. Hoffenheim, the promoted sensation, surged into the picture and went into the winter break sitting on the top on goal difference. Hertha Berlin hung around. Hamburg hung around. And Wolfsburg hung around too, but from farther back. And that is crucial. Wolfsburg were not one of those teams who led from August and simply refused to leave. By matchday 13, they were 9th and 9 points off their leaders. And according to the Bundesliga own retrospective, they were still 9th at the halfway stage, still 9 behind the joint leaders, Hoffenheim and Bayern. So even in winter, this did not look like a future title team. It looked like a good side having a decent season in a chaotic league. That chaos was the opportunity, because the 2008-09 Bundesliga was unusually open at the top. The defending champions were strong enough to stay relevant, but not stable enough to dominate. Hertha were credible, but not overwhelming. Hamburg were in it. Hoffenheim had exploded into the league, but nobody yet knew whether they could carry that pace to May. And then Wolfsburg changed gear. After the winter break, Magath's team became something much harsher, more direct, more confident, more ruthless. They won 10 league games in a row for matchday 19, and that run is the bridge to this episode. Now we zoom in on the title race before kickoff on April 4. The international break had just ended. After matchday 25, Hertha was number 1 on 49 points, with Bayern, Wolfsburg and Hamburg all on 48. That table is the whole mood of the season, crowded, unstable, ready to swing. And then matchday 26 starts moving. Hertha lose 3-1 at home to Borussia Dortmund. Hamburg beat Hoffenheim 1-0. And so the door opens. And through that door walk Wolfsburg and Bayern. The match itself matters because it was not some weird fluke of deflections and red cards. It was a statement. Bayern had the bigger names, Lucio, Ribéry, Schweinsteiger, Luca Toni, and Klinsmann on the touchline. All the usual Bayern self-importance still attached. But Wolfsburg had developed something more dangerous for one specific afternoon. Clarity. They knew exactly how they wanted to hurt Bayern. And once they started landing blows, they didn't stop. Christian Gentner gave Wolfsburg the lead in the 44th minute, but Bayern hit back immediately through Luca Toni in the 45th. At halftime, it was 1-1, and you could still imagine the usual Bayern recovery narrative: absorb the noise, improve after the break, take control, and leave with a result. But that is not what happened. Instead, Wolfsburg detonated. Edin Dzeko made it 2-1 in the 63rd minute, and 3 minutes later, he made it 3-1. And yes, we're talking about the same Edin Dzeko who, only last week and shortly after his 40th birthday, led Bosnia-Herzegovina to its second World Cup after eliminating Italy. But now, Bayern were no longer merely behind. They were wobbling. Then came Grafit. First the fourth goal in the 74th minute, and then, 3 minutes later, the one everyone remembers. It drove into the Bayern box, slalomed through defenders, rounded the keeper, and somehow finished with a back heel. 5-1 on a back heel against Bayern in a title race, with the stadium losing its mind. That is the emotional center of the story. Not just that Wolfsburg won, but how they won. This was not a cautious upset. It was an exposure, a humiliation. One of those afternoons when the giant does not simply lose, it is shown up. And once the scoreline reached 5-1, the table changed with it. After matchday 26, Wolfsburg now had 51 points, level with Hamburg, but first on goal difference. Hertha dropped to third on 49, and Bayern fell to fourth on 48. One afternoon had rearranged the whole race. But so what? Well, this was the day Wolfsburg stopped looking like outsiders and started looking like the team to catch. Before April 4th, they had come from 9 points off the leaders to being contenders in a crowded field. After April 4, they had the psychological upper hand. That is not mystical language. It is what the run shows. The win over Bayern put them top, and the victories kept coming. The season acquired a new logic. If Wolfsburg could do that to Bayern, why should they fear anyone else? Moreover, the scale of the achievement for club and city was enormous. Wolfsburg were not winning their 5th or 6th title. They were winning their first. In fact, it was the club's first German championship of any kind. And in Bundesliga history, that is rare enough to matter. Wolfsburg became the 12th different club to win the Bundesliga. That alone tells you how exclusive the company was. And they did it in a manner that still feels improbable now. They had been 9th at halfway. They had spent the first part of the season in the slipstream rather than the spotlight. Then spring came, the streak caught fire, and suddenly this relatively young Bundesliga club from Wolfsburg had the strongest attack in the country and the momentum of champions. And the season worked perfectly for them because everybody else kept blinking. Hertha led after matchday 25, but lost at home when the pressure tightened. Hamburg stayed in the fight, but not quite with enough force. Hoffenheim were the autumn sensation, but not the spring finishers. And Bayern, the club you expect to impose order on a messy season, kept failing to turn opportunity into control. That is one of the defining truths of 2008-09. Wolfsburg were excellent in the run-in, but they were also excellent in exactly the right kind of season. A season where the big favorite never took command, where the challengers all had flaws, and where one sustained spring surge could redraw the entire map. Bayern's side of the story is just as revealing. Klinsmann had been hired to push the club forward. Instead, Bayern spent the season lurching. The 5-1 at Wolfsburg was not the only blow, but is one of the most vivid. 3 weeks later, after a poor run culminated in a 1-0 home defeat to Schalke, Bayern sacked him, and Jupp Heynckes came in as caretaker for the final 5 matches. And that too tells you something about Bayern. When they wobble, they still do it like Bayern, abruptly, coldly, and with a veteran solution waiting nearby. Then came the flex. The following season they took the title back under Louis van Gaal, and even then, German football had not yet entered the longest imperial phase. The 11 straight Bayern titles were still a few years away, but you can already feel the institutional reflex. One season lost, fix it, recover, reassert. Which makes Wolfsburg title look even more special in hindsight. It came in one of those narrowing windows before Bayern's later monopoly hardened into routine. And then there's the football itself. Grafit finished the season with 28 league goals. Dzeko had 26. So together they scored 54, one of the great strike partnerships in Bundesliga history. Misimovic fed them with 20 assists. Wolfsburg scored 80 league goals, more than anyone else. So yes, this was a surprise champion, but not a lucky one. The attack was simply too strong. and once confidence took hold, it overwhelmed the league. And by the end of May, Wolfsburg were champions by 2 points. If you want to know when that became truly believable, you start here. April 4, 5-1, Bayern on the floor. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 4, 2009. First, this was not just a sensational result. It was the day a crowded title race acquired a new center of gravity. And second, Wolfsburg title was shocking, not because they were weak, but because they were still such a new force in Bundesliga terms. A club barely more than a decade into top flight life, suddenly staring down Bayern and not blinking. And third, improbable title wins usually need 2 ingredients: a challenger that catches fire and a favorite that never quite takes control. And Wolfsburg had both working for them in 2008-09. On this day in 2009, Wolfsburg hammered Bayern Munich 5-1, went top of the Bundesliga, and turned a lively title race into the greatest season in the club's history. That's all for episode 155 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with all your friends. Tomorrow, we go to April 5, 1972, when Dynamo Berlin and Dynamo Moscow met in Europe for the first time. A Cold War semi-final between 2 clubs carrying far more than football in their names. See you tomorrow.